going to hand you over to Audrey, and I am going to be quiet. So let me, Audrey's microphone is on. My microphone is now going to be.
Okay, I think that means that I'm on. So thank you, Andy, for a really nice introduction. You can't get better than John Muir, can you? So first, I want to thank Dartmoor National Park Authority for inviting me to speak with you this evening. I'm more used to interactive conversations than talking at people, so I will be really pleased to hear your questions later so we can make better contact. It's an irony that there've never been more people wanting to help wildlife, yet there's a feeling of helplessness too. And time and again, we hear people say, "What on earth can I do all on my own?" Or, "I've only got a tiny garden, that can't help wildlife much." Or, "Farmers and rich landowners, they've got all the power, they own the land." Or maybe developers, they just do what they like and it's only going to get worse. Well, I'm Audrey Compton. I'm a farmer on the eastern edge of Dartmoor, and I don't like feeling helpless. I'm one of those annoying people who wants to save the world, or at the very least, to save its wildlife, parish by parish. So how did I get here? And how did wildlife get in this terrible state? It's a sort of parallel path. When I was a child in the 1950s, post-war Britain was a monochrome place. It was shabby, it was dirty, it was quite poor. People were thin or slim, food was valued and took up a large amount of our family budget. Farming was a respected job because it kept people fed. Hunger and a lack of good food was a real problem then, and now it is again. As a child, I remember being really into wildlife, and in 1962, my amazing Glossy was new then, my BBC Animals magazine serialised the newly published book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. I read it, I felt sad, I felt worried. But when I tried to talk about it to my highly respected biology teacher, she ridiculed me. And sadly, 55 years later, things haven't completely changed. When I came into farming in the late 1960s, the food shortages and the rationing of the war were not a distant memory. They dictated agricultural policy. Through the 60s and 70s and beyond, the Ministry of Agriculture's mantra was to make every tiny piece of ground productive, to grub out hedges, orchards and woodlands, to grow more food. And there were grants for farmers that covered most of the costs, and there were guaranteed prices for our farm produce. From 1970, for nearly 25 years, I was a tenant dairy farmer, using lots of fertiliser, just as the government advisors and our bank manager told us to, and long before anyone was talking about fertilisers affecting the climate. We loved our hedges. They were very useful for sheltering our cows and controlling grazing. But a neighbouring farmer had taken out miles of hedges, and when heavy rain followed him ploughing, the red soil flowed like tomato ketchup into the brook and right out to sea. But we had grubbed out a very steep old cider orchard. There was no demand for the fruit. The trees were covered in brambles, but it was good habitat. I'm not sure the word habitat had even been invented then, and so we just didn't think. Since then, I've tried to make amends by looking after orchards and encouraging a lot more planting. In 1973, conservation simply wasn't on the agenda. When we were thinking of building a slurry store to protect the Dawlish water from pollution, we were told by a ministry advisor to hose the slurry into the brook. We built the slurry store anyway. Policies encouraging production accelerated when we joined the EU, and until the mid-80s, when quotas were suddenly introduced because of food mountains. Okay, sorry. Suddenly, farmers were under a lot of financial pressure. I've always loved nature, and I could see that our wildlife was disappearing. The barn owls that we'd watched as they quartered our big floodplain meadows, they'd gone. We later realised it was because the fertiliser made our grass grow lush, it was then grazed short, and there was no home for voles there. The common spotted orchids that had grown in Oak Park before we fertilised it, they'd gone. At that time, I didn't understand that fertiliser could kill wildflowers simply by making the grass grow long, thick, and strong. They were as good as herbicides. From 1990 to 1993, I retrained in conservation. And for the next 15 years, I worked as a Teignbridge ranger. I was working with people after 25 years of isolation. I was working for wildlife after inadvertently having worked against it. During that time, while I was a ranger, John and I bought Deer Park Farm. It's a poor farm, and it's unlikely that it's ever been very profitable, maybe only in times of war. Between us, we work about 60 hours a week. I'll tell you now that I've tried this talk out so many times today that I've nearly lost my voice. Sorry about that. So we work about 60 hours a week together. And even with the grants for looking after wildlife, it only makes a profit of about £3,000, £4,000 or £5,000 a year. Not quite enough to live on. Now, in the 21st century, food has never been cheaper. And that means that farming is in a bad place. Even more so with the uncertainties about Brexit and COVID. No wonder wildlife is suffering. Farmers are currently paid an EU government subsidy for every hectare, that's 2.5 acres, of land that they farm. So small farmers get much less support than big landowners. There are agri-environment schemes which make payments for wildlife which really don't cover the cost of the work involved. So although many farmers enjoy the wildlife around them, they can't afford to help it as much as they would like to. Looking at our farm can explain what has gone wrong elsewhere. Our farm is very, very steep, and that is why it's got good wildlife. Until four-wheel drive tractors became common, only an idiot would have ploughed, fertilised or sprayed our fields, and that has saved the flowers. We've got, I think, about 380 species of flowers, trees and ferns on the farm. So that's because it's steep and too difficult. Our woodlands are even steeper. They're wild and they're rocky, and they couldn't be cleared for pasture, so they've survived too. Our hedges, they're too steep to flail. The tractor would turn over, so they're rotationally laid about every 15 or 20 years. They're not laid just because John loves hedge laying, but they also provide us with lots of wood fuel for our cooking, hot water for our baths, and warmth instead of central heating. But also they provide brilliant habitats, big thick hedges which are almost vermin proof, if you like. So if you're sitting on a nice nest of eggs, it's going to make it much harder for a fox to come and grab you. Not that foxes are vermin, they're great and we've got plenty of them, but it does make it a little bit easier for rare species to actually survive. Our sheep and our cattle look after our wildflower meadows and pastures. We farm on organic principles with a low stocking rate so that some flowers can set seed every year. Without our animals, our meadows will become scrub and then turn into woodland. They're both wonderful habitats, but they're not nearly as rare as the flowers, the butterflies, the moths, the bees, and all the other mini beasts that live in our meadows. We hope that the new 2025 agri-environment schemes will be well enough funded to attract farmers, because this is what we desperately need. So, in between ranger work and our farm, I've been working with climate action groups for nearly 20 years now. So, in 2019, when Teignbridge District Council declared a climate emergency and an ambition to be carbon neutral by 2025, 4 of us realised that the council was going to need a lot of help. So we got together, we did some networking, and we set up Action on Climate in Teignbridge, which we call ACT, to support them. We now have about 370 members and about 350 Facebook followers. Soon after that, the councillors passed a motion formally agreeing that Teignbridge District Council and Action on Climate in Teignbridge should work together to achieve carbon neutrality as quickly as possible. It may be the only partnership of this sort in the UK. We haven't heard of another. So Teignbridge is quite big. It's got 50 parishes, most of them are outside of Dartmoor National Park, but 15 of them are either inside or partly inside. And obviously in those areas, Dartmoor National Park Authority has a very large role. Dartmoor National Park Authority declared its climate and ecological emergency in July 2019. When we started ACT, I was really happy to start up the ACT Ecology Group and the Food Farming and Forestry Group, because all those 4 things are really inextricable. They're both the problems and the solutions to many of our planet's woes. They soon became 2 really strong groups, including many ecologists, naturalists, farmers, growers and foresters. They're really interesting, friendly groups. The Ecology Group came up with some brilliant ways to help our local wildlife. Things like surveying our local areas, drawing up connectivity maps so that we can join our habitats up, advising and helping landowners, and helping them to create better habitats and improve the ones they've got, promoting wildlife gardening, checking planning applications for possible problems, and watching developments to see if they're fulfilling the conditions, and setting up a wildlife warden scheme, all the usual stuff. Then there came a light bulb moment when we realised that if we had wardens in every parish in Teignbridge, they could do all the work for us. So this is our great idea. We reckon that we need between 2 and 5 wildlife wardens in every parish. So if you do the maths, that's between 100 and 250 wildlife wardens, and that's a lot of people. Everything we read said how much people were appreciating their wildlife. So we felt that there was sure to be lots of people out there who would want to help. But how much did they know? Could they identify different sorts of wildlife? Could they survey a wildlife site? Could they talk to a farmer and understand how hard it is looking after wildlife when you're making too small a profit to look after your family? I've been there, I've done that. Did any of them know how to use interactive mapping and recording systems? Would they be able to persuade their neighbours to garden organically? Were they familiar with Teignbridge and Dartmoor's weekly planning lists? Could they work together? Could they work with their communities? This was not the time to panic or look for a plan B. Instead, we looked at the expertise within our group and the likelihood that some of our volunteers would already have considerable skills, which indeed we found they've got massive skills or a real wish to learn. So we realised that we could train our wildlife wardens. And I really felt excited because we had a plan. The detail was more demanding, as it was obvious that coordinating a lot of people over a large area, although it wasn't that difficult, it would take a lot of time up and mean setting up really good, efficient systems. And even if members of the ecology group took on all the different roles, between us, we didn't think we got enough time. We always thought that funding was really difficult, but we made about 6 or 7 applications to small funders, and that's given us nearly £5,000, which is enough for us to pay a self-employed coordinator for nearly 10 hours a week, as well as paying for various other necessities. So this is a really good time to thank our backers. Our first one was Teen Energy Communities Community Group. Then Councillor Jackie Hooks, Devon County Council Locality Fund. Dartmoor National Park Authority has also helped us, and so has the Nineveh Trust. We also want to thank our supporters, Teignbridge District Council, Devon Wildlife Trust, Devon Biodiversity Records Centre and the Woodland Trust. So I got going during lockdown 1 and planned a scheme in some detail, but we didn't want to have a big launch until we had enough funding to appoint a coordinator to help with a rush of applicants. So we just advertised it in our ACT newsletter so that we could pilot an introductory training day with a small group of wardens, just to find out if we knew what we were doing. We quickly had a group of 7 volunteers and we got started. For our first training day, Elliot Fairs from Dodderscomsley, Ian Stone from Tresham and I did the training together, and it was a great day for all of us, and it seemed to work. Being COVID careful meant training just 6 wildlife wardens at a time on a dry, sunny October day spent outside or in an open fronted barn, meeting each other, walking around the farm and talking about various roles that wildlife wardens could take, how to communicate well, how to recognise good and bad habitats, how to make them better, how to create more, how to make good risk assessments, because we want our wildlife wardens to be safe. At the same time, we realised that there were several local wildlife groups popping up all over Teignbridge. They were taking on various parish projects. Could they become parish wildlife wardens too? So Bettina from our ecology group invited them to a Zoom meeting, and we found that several of them do indeed want to be parish wardens, as well as wanting to share ideas with each other. Flavio joined us as a coordinator a month ago, and he's been an absolutely enormous help. So 35 people have now applied to be wildlife wardens, with more applications arriving all the time. By Thursday, 19 would have completed their introductory training. So we've got 20 more to train at the minute, and many more have asked for information and are preparing their application forms. So what are they going to do now? Well, we're preparing a list of projects for them with ideas to help them carry them out, and we will always be there to support them. We're just an email away, or perhaps a phone call away, a Zoom, or even a visit when things are just a little bit easier. So the sort of projects we're thinking about are how to plant a new hedge, a new orchard, a new wood, how to get small funds for the projects, how to encourage your local school to become a wildlife warden so we can involve the younger generation too, and how to manage community open spaces for wildlife and people. Well, being an ACT wildlife warden is a responsibility. We've got a code of conduct which tries to make sure that we all communicate well and that we respect everybody that we work with. That means farmers, parish councillors, gardeners, planners, developers. We all need to be friends, and we all need to be nature's friends. Well, this won't be a tidy, overstructured scheme, because wildlife isn't tidy. And that's one of the biggest reasons we've lost it, because we have become so tidy that we haven't left any room for our wildlife. Our wildlife doesn't stick to parish boundaries. It doesn't read the maps. It doesn't read the books that tell it just how it should behave, where it should live, what it should eat, where it should live, how it should survive. They just don't do that. So we all need to work together if we're going to help our wildlife to survive. And we aren't separate from the ecological system. We are wildlife too. It's us that are driving the planet's ecosystem towards disaster, but it's us who can do something about it. Wildlife is out there and it's just waiting for you to do something. So let's have wildlife wardens all over Teignbridge within a year, the whole of Devon next year, England the year after, then the world. There we are.
That's great. Thank you, Audrey.